Hello, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And today I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Emad Hamdeh. You're most welcome, sir. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. It's a pleasure to be back.
Great to have you back, sir. Dr. Emad is an associate professor of Arabic studies at Embry-Riddle University in Florida and a scholar of Islamic studies. He is the editor of the Oxford University Handbook on Islamic Reform. He is also the author of several books, including The Necessity of Hadith in Islam and Salafism and Traditionalism, Scholarly Authority in Modern Islam. His research focuses on Hadith, Islamic law, and Islamic intellectual history, and he has published in several peer-reviewed journals. He has also published several articles with Yaqeen Institute. He is currently working on a book about the life and legacy of Yusuf al-Qaradawi, one of the most influential Muslim scholars of the modern era, and I can't wait to read that when it comes out, inshallah. So the question today is Western Hadith scholarship truly as rigorous and objective as it claims, or is it shaped by flawed assumptions and Orientalist bias and blind spots in its approach to knowledge? Dr. Emad, inshallah, will examine the foundations of Western academic approaches to Hadith, with a special focus on the idea that if early sources don't mention something, it likely didn't exist. This method, championed by scholars such as Joseph Schacht, has deeply influenced how Hadith are studied and often dismissed in Western circles. But is this really sound historical reasoning, or is it a modern lens imposed on a tradition with its own robust standards of transmission, verification, and critique? So over to you, sir.
Thank you so much, Paul, again, for having me back again. Yep, there we go. Okay, so today I'm going to basically try to walk us through the idea of Western Hadith approaches. So many times, at least in Muslim circles, right, when you hear people talk about Western Orientalist approaches towards Hadith, there's this response from Muslims that it's bias, right, or there's flaws in the methodology, but it's rarely explained, right? So it's just like, kind of pushed back on and rarely explained. So today I want to walk through, number one, what biases are there, what projections are made onto Islamic tradition from their own lens, and then walk through the case of Joseph Schacht's argument from silence. Just for the record, that this has been, I kind of drew from the works of Muhammad Mustafa Al-Azami, who has this great book called Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence. He's written much on it, so I kind of drew from some of his works, and I do also address this in my own book as well. Wow. So Orientalism or Western Hadith scholarship sometimes is viewed as secular or neutral, right? This is the projection or the portrayal it has. However, when we look at Western scholars studying Islam, we need to understand that they are usually coming from a history with Christianity. So an analogy I like to give is like, for example, somebody who has a bad relationship, who enters, gets married to someone and they have a bad relationship, and then they move on to another partner and they start projecting their old partner's bad habits or history onto the new partner.
Wow, that's a fantastic. I've never heard this analogy before. It's so insightful, I must say.
Yeah, I mean, every time I hear, for example, something like Islam, religion and science are incompatible, right? I just think, well, this is really coming from your experience with Christianity. And
with Galileo and Copernicus and all these people got in trouble with the church, i.e. religion, therefore, well, it must be similar in other religions like Islam, which is not, of course.
Yeah, and then it's just projected onto Islam, right? So here's just like I guess we can look at the lens that they come with, right? So there's this idea that, for example, the New Testament is compiled centuries after Jesus. And this is historically accurate. However, this is not the case with the Quran, but and Hadith. So when Western scholars study the Quran or the Hadith, we see that they do one of two things. Either they'll say something like the Quran came before Muhammad, or it came after. But they cannot acknowledge or just accept that, or historically that it was there during his time, right? This stems from the history of Christianity. When it comes to tradition, so the Gospels contain later theological additions. So therefore, when they study Hadith, they will say something, well, Hadith came later as well, and they were largely fabricated. What's really interesting, especially, is the case of law, because especially Joseph Schacht, anytime one of his main arguments was that Islamic law developed later on. Scholars developed this later on. They borrowed this from other civilizations, whether it was Roman law, Jewish law, and then they brought it into Islam. What's interesting about this is that the Quran itself has law. The Quran itself speaks about inheritance. It speaks about divorce. It'll speak about certain crimes and whatnot. So from its origin, Islam is a religion that contains law. However, he cannot imagine that Islamic civilization or Muslims were sophisticated enough to have their own law. They're too stupid, right, to have their own law. So they must have gotten it from somewhere else. And the way he does this is he finds parallels between Islamic law and Roman law, for example. But a parallel does not mean that it was borrowed. It could be, for example, that let's just say there's a case of divorce in Roman law, and they come up with a solution. And divorce is common in human life and society. And then there's a divorce in Islamic society, and they come up with a similar solution, or Islam provides a similar solution. This doesn't mean borrowing. It just means that the solutions were similar. So even in some works, like even some Orientalists, I don't remember his name right now, but I do mention it in one of my Yaqeen articles. After the Quranic verses in manuscripts, they put a dot, right? It's just a simple dot to separate the verses. And he argued that this idea of this dot was also borrowed from other cultures. So even Muslims were not sophisticated enough to just come up with the concept of separating sentences by a period, right?
So this part is sort of kind of patronizing racism, really, that you have to come up with these explanations who can possibly thought of it themselves. This is very unfortunate, I think. Yeah,
it's the savior mindset where they don't know. We saved ourselves from our own tradition. We saved ourselves from our own corrupt history between religion and the state, and therefore we're coming to save you as well. And I guess here is where I'm going to approach when we talk about the Schacht's argument from silence. So Christian orthodoxy emerged through later councils. And then this was projected later on to the Bible. So he does something similar with Hadith. His approach towards Hadith is that Islamic law, and especially in Hadith, could not have come from the Prophet, could not have come from the time of the companions. It must have been projected back, just like the later councils in Christianity projected this back to the Bible or the teachings. So here in his work, this is his work, Origin of Muhammadan Jurisprudence, where he himself lays out what he calls the best way of proving that a tradition, when he says tradition here, he means a hadith, did not exist at a certain time, is to show that it was not used as a legal argument in a discussion, which would have made reference to it imperative if it had existed. What he means here is that if there is a scholar or two scholars who are having a debate, okay, let's just say, for example, in Salah, the Shafi'is, they would say you must raise your hands after ruku'. The Hanafis, they would say not. So if there's a Shafi'i scholar, let's just take Imam al-Shafi'i himself, who's making this argument. So he says you must raise your hands, but he doesn't cite a hadith. And later on, the student of a Shafi'i, or one of his disciples, or a generation later, they come and they make the same argument, but now suddenly they cite a hadith. Joseph Schacht says this is proof, because otherwise, why didn't a Shafi'i himself cite it? This, at face value, sounds convincing. However, there's a lot of assumptions that are carried with this. So I'm going to just kind of give an example of this. So we have here, this is an example of what Joseph Schacht is basically arguing, and I have a few more examples. So here he says, for example, we have Ibrahim al-Nakhai, who died in 96 Hijri. Let's just say he didn't use a hadith. And Ibrahim al-Nakhai's student was Hamad, and Hamad was the teacher of Abu Hanifa. Now, let's just say that Ibrahim al-Nakhai cited, or he had a legal opinion, and he didn't really support it with a hadith. And later on, we find Abu Hanifa using that hadith, or citing a hadith. Well, Schacht will say, this hadith must have been fabricated by either Abu Hanifa or his teacher Hamad. However, this doesn't always work, because you can turn the tables, and some scholars have done this here, and we find many examples. This is just one here, but if you refer to the work of Al-Azami, which I mentioned earlier, and you can also look at my own hadith book. There's also a article in 1984 by a scholar by the name of Zafar Ishaq Ansari who did this as well. So basically, if you look at the relationship between Imam Malik and Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani. Now, who are these two people? Imam Malik is the founder of the Maliki school of thought, and he was a hadith scholar.
Yeah. Can I just show folks this lovely volume, Al-Muwatta, which you're referring to? It's a new translation by Muhammad Fadl, published by Harvard, and it's just been out a couple of years. And this is a translation of this extraordinary work. It says a translation of the Royal Moroccan edition, and this is probably the earliest. It says the Muwatta, written in the 8th century CE by Malik ibn Anas, known as the Imam of Medina, is the first surviving written treatise of Islamic law. So fantastic work. Anyway,
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So Malik ibn Anas was a hadith scholar who wrote the Muwatta. Right, the Muwatta was his hadith book, and Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani is one of the main students of Abu Hanifa, who also studied with Imam Malik. So al-Shaybani actually took Imam Malik's Muwatta and he wrote a version of it, but more towards his own school of thought, which is the Hanafi school of thought. So he actually removed certain hadith. So now we have the case where there's an earlier scholar mentioning a hadith and it's not mentioned by a later scholar. What's interesting is that there are sometimes hadith he removes that actually support his school. So we have, for example, there's a difference of opinion between the Malikis and the Hanafis on the best time to pray Fajr in congregation. So the Malikis, they say it's best to pray it during the darker part of the Fajr. The Hanafis, they say that it's best to pray it when there's some light outside, when there's some yellow light outside. And this hadith is in Malik's Muwatta that supports the Hanafi position. And al-Shaybani later comes and he is definitely familiar with Malik's Muwatta and he's definitely familiar with this hadith, but he does not include it. So according to Schacht's methodology or his argument from silence, Shaybani should have definitely mentioned it, especially because it's the perfect opportunity for him to include it. Now, if one were to argue, for example, that maybe al-Shaybani, for whatever reason, did not know it, this is inaccurate because al-Shaybani actually uses the same hadith in another one of his works. So why does a scholar choose to not cite a hadith or cite a hadith, right? There's hundreds of reasons for this. There's many reasons, which I'll go through in a moment. But Schacht is really, he's really oversimplifying it here. There's also an interesting case of counter evidence. So in my original YouTube video, I didn't have this slide here, but this is something I found, and there's dozens of this. So we have here another student of Abu Hanifa whose name is Abu Yusuf. So he has a book called the Athar, which is narrating hadiths, right? So here you see hadith number 208, which is the bottom one, and hadith number 209. So there's a chapter in the Quran called Surah Sad, chapter Sad. And in this chapter, there is a verse about David, falling into prostration and seeking forgiveness. So the scholars, they differ whether Muslims should also fall into prostration here. The Hanafis say you should. The Shafi'is say you don't. Okay, but we see here that one of the first I want to just point out that if you look at the narrators, they're all Iraqi and they're all Hanafi, right? So we have Abu Hanifa, who is the narrator, right? So these aren't like a Shafi'i, like according to Schacht, this isn't like a Shafi'i chain of narration. These are all Hanafis, right? So we have Abu Hanifa from Hamad, from Abdul Karim, who said the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he prostrated when he recited this verse in Surah Sad. Okay, أنه سجد في صاد. So this supports the Hanafi position. However, the narration before this, 208 here, in Athar of Abu Yusuf, he cites a hadith again from the same type of scholars who are Iraqi essentially, Kufin, which essentially is the Hanafi school of thought, from Abu Hanifa, from Hamad, from Ibrahim, from Ibn Mas'ud, that the Prophet ﷺ would not prostrate during Sad. Now, why would they make up a hadith just to reject it? Why would they make up a hadith that goes against their own school of thought?
Mm-hmm.
You cannot argue here, well, this hadith was made up by others and then they rejected it, because it is them who is narrating it. This is actually a case of scholarly integrity where they found a source, it went against their understanding, right? And of course, they interpreted this. They had reasons for this. They may have found the hadith weak or whatnot, but they did not throw it away. If these scholars were just going out to kind of just push their school's teachings, it would have been best to just throw this hadith out. And they are the narrators themselves. There's something else that's very skeptical about Schacht's approach and Western Orientalism in general, is that there's this idea of scholars just being liars. There's no, like, they approach the scholar as a liar and there's no integrity, and they assume that there's mass lying. So they assume that now in the 2nd century, there's not only the Kufan scholars are lying, but the Madani, the scholars in Medina, the scholars all over Arabia are all getting together and fabricating hadith collectively, and no one is calling another person out. And this is impossible, because there's hadith that have been quote unquote fabricated in Medina, and there's hadith that have been fabricated in Iraq, and they had no way of communicating with each other. This is before the telephone, before the internet. So you'll find chains of narration of a similar hadith. You'll find a hadith with different chains of narration in Iraq, and you'll find it also in Medina, but the text is the same. How could they have done this without the modern communication and telephone and whatnot? So it's assuming that these scholars are, lying. And this is where I think when we say historical critical method, right? When people speak of the critical part, it's actually the scholar himself who decides what to be critical about. Joseph Schacht is the one who's deciding, I want to be critical about this and not that, right? There are many other things that you could have been critical about as well, but they choose. And here he chose law in specific because he's coming from the idea that Muslims were not sophisticated enough to come up with their own law, or Islamic text itself, like the Bible, could not have been the source of this law. It must have come later on. He's projecting this on. So when he says he wants to be critical, he's really critical of this aspect. Just like Christianity could not come up with its own, sources or its own teachings originally from that Bible in its earliest moments, Islam could also have not done that as well. So here there are many assumptions, right, that come with Joseph Schacht's argument from silence. But one thing I want to point out beforehand is even his selection of which works to focus on is problematic, because if you look at Joseph Schacht's work, he's actually looking at fiqh works. He's looking at fiqh books, right? These are books of law for hadith documentation. And this is not the place for it. He's looking in the wrong place, because law books are not places where scholars even intended to preserve hadith. It was places where they were arguing with each other on legal matters. So if he really wanted to know, look at his historical hadith documentation, hadith works would have made much more sense. So I in my YouTube video, I gave an analogy, right, that kind of simplifies what is Schacht even doing, right? So imagine there are no pictures of you. You look at your family photo album, and from the age of, let's just say 1 until 6 or 7 years old, there are no pictures. You're looking through this album, you can't find yourself in any of them. And then suddenly you appear at the age of 8, right? So Joseph Schacht's argument is basically that you were adopted. You did not exist. Your family, you were adopted, and now your family suddenly throwing you into the photo album so they can prove to you that you are always part of the family. This may be the case. There are cases where people are adopted, but this is such a large jump and assumption to make, and it carries a lot of weight, right? The weight it carries is that this person is, not a part of the family, right? So there is the possibility that your family had a specific photo book that had your pictures in it, and you just didn't see it, you didn't find it yet. It could have been that it was lost. It could have been that you were a child who didn't like taking pictures. Hundreds of assumptions, right? Or hundreds of reasons why you were not in those pictures. It could have been you were living with a family member out of state, whatever it is, right? So he focuses on exactly the point he wanted to make originally, is that you are too sophisticated to belong to this family. This family is not, not good enough for you. They couldn't have produced you, so you are therefore adopted. So anyway, let's go through some of the assumptions that Joseph Schacht makes. One of them is that there's this idea of complete citation practice, that legal doctrines were always recorded with their supporting hadith. Now, when scholars speak to each other, especially in these fiqh books, they are speaking to other scholars. They are not addressing a lay person. It's not a website where they're trying to educate people. They are having a legal debate. And there's no need to go back and cite every single evidence in great detail, right? They don't need to cite the entire isnad. They may just say the hadith about intention, or the hadith about wudu, or they just may name the hadith, or sometimes not even name it, because it's known. They are speaking to someone who knows the sources themselves. And this is also done in American law. Like if you look at legal arguments with among lawyers themselves, they won't go back and cite the entire case that they are referring to. They'll just say case 1, precedent 2, whatever that is. So scholars did not have this, they weren't always citing everything they knew. Something else that he assumes is that there's universal knowledge, right? A hadith known to one scholar was necessarily known to all scholars at his time. So let's just go back to my example from Ash-Shafi'i. Let's just say Ash-Shafi'i did argue that you should raise your hands, but he did not know the hadith. Let's just say there was a hadith and he did not know it, and therefore he did not cite it. This does not mean absence, because just because Ash-Shafi'i does not know the hadith does not mean it doesn't exist. There are hundreds and thousands of other scholars who are around. They may know the hadith and he just didn't. Even Ash-Shafi'i himself, in one of his books, he mentions that sometimes he forgot hadith, or he thought the hadith was weak, therefore he didn't use it, or it came to him through a weak chain or something along those lines. Another point is that there's this assumption of perfect preservation. That every single hadith, all scholarly works that were circulating at the time have reached us. And we know historically this is not the case. There are books that are lost in history. There are manuscripts that are yet to be, found and published. So Ash-Shafi'i could have had another book where he cited this hadith. Or for example, if we go back to the example of Ash-Shaybani, where he edited Malik's Muwatta and he did not include the hadith on the prayer that supported the Hanafi position. He has another book called Al-Hujjaj where he cites this hadith. If this book was lost in history, Schacht would have said he doesn't know it. But the fact that we have that secondary book of his where he actually cites the hadith shows that a scholar sometimes would cite a hadith in one book and not another. And if the other book is lost, it doesn't mean, there is a possibility that that book is lost, and it doesn't mean that he did not know it. And then, as I mentioned, this idea that there's flawless memory, scholars never forgot traditions. And not only that, sometimes a scholar may know a hadith very well, and he may not cite it because he does not believe it to be convincing evidence. So Schacht is projecting on his own understanding of the hadith and its implications onto the scholar. So Schacht is arguing that, well, this hadith definitely supports raising the hands. Ash-Shafi'i may have known it, but he may have said, hey, this hadith doesn't really support my case, so I'm not going to cite it. And then there's also the idea that the hadith may not have been sufficient evidence from a isnad perspective, right? He may have said, well, the chain of narration is not strong enough for me. So Schacht is kind of making all of these assumptions that come along with it. And then there is the final assumption here is that there's this idea of comprehensive writing, that when a scholar cites a hadith or makes an argument, that he's going to cite every piece of evidence that is there. And actually, Abu Yusuf in his Athar, or in one of his books, I think it's the Athar, he's making a legal point. And he says, Lawla tul, had it not been for length, that this would have taken up many pages, I would have cited many more pieces of evidence. So if we look here, when we say, to kind of wrap it up, if we go back to the beginning that I kind of mentioned, the lens that Schacht and Orientalists are using, they're using the lens of a history with Christianity, that tradition and text and scripture was not preserved, and it could not have been preserved. Therefore, the same must apply to Islam. And they come and they'll present a methodology like this argument from silence that will then be used to make a similar conclusion. So the conclusion is already there, that Islamic scripture could not have been preserved. If Muslims think so, they must be as foolish as those early Christians who thought they preserved their own text as well. And I am here to show them, just like the West liberated itself from Christianity, we are here to liberate Islam from its own traditions, and we're going to really show those Muslims how their texts were not preserved. But we see here that it's a really selective method of arguing, and lots of assumptions that are carried with it.
Okay, so that's the last one. So, I mean, the question I have, Joseph Schacht's book, The Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, is a magnum opus. So, should we, if we're educated laymen, should we even read this book today? Its influence was so phenomenal, wasn't it, in the 20th century on Hadith studies in the Western Academy? Should we acquaint ourselves with it? Should we read it, or should we not really bother? What do you think?
Yeah, so I think, I'm never against anyone reading anything, but I also think when you approach any text, you have to have the proper tools, right, to do that. I don't like throwing like a child in the deep end of the pool and just saying, like, learn how to swim. Maybe start at the shallow end first and make your way up.
Yeah.
But definitely, if someone is interested in this field, Joseph Schacht's work is one of the more popular works in the West. But it's been responded to in great detail, as I mentioned earlier on in the book, by Al-Azami, who goes in immense detail. So I would read both together.
But Al-Azami could be said, but he was obviously a Muslim. There's nothing wrong. Obviously, I'm not committing the genetic fallacy here by saying, well, because someone's a Muslim, therefore he was bi. But someone like Wael Hallaq, for example, professor at Columbia, which actually wasn't at the university that Joseph Schacht.
Yes, Joseph Schacht, and
it was a kind of British German guy who ended up teaching at Columbia, and Wael Hallaq is from the birthplace of Jesus, apparently Nazareth.
Yes.
And in Palestine, ended up at exactly the same university as a professor. But I mentioned to him, has he critiqued the book as well? Because he's very hot on Islamic law.
Yeah. So Hallaq also critiqued it, but I wouldn't discount Azami's work just because he's Muslim.
No, of course.
Because if you look at it, it's actually, he's approaching it from a logical, academic, historical way. Right. So when Schacht himself, as I mentioned, is not coming from some kind of neutral, biased place. And there's this idea, I guess, from colonization, where that we don't know our tradition enough. Everything we do is like, Muslims, in parts of the world who are colonized may think of themselves or their tradition as just incapable of being free thinkers, of being people who have the ability to navigate text academically. So Azami was a graduate from Cambridge, and he was a scholar, and he did do his PhD, and I think his work should be taken into account just like anyone else's.
Of course. So his book his response was on Schacht's origins of Mohammedan jurisprudence, a systematic response to Schacht's thesis. So is that the definitive response to that book, do you think?
Yeah, actually, yes, I think it definitely is. It's the most detailed, definitely the most detailed that I've encountered, because it's an entire book that's dedicated to that. He kind of walks through point by point of Schacht's arguments. He walks through this argument from silence in great detail. So it is the most detailed, but he kind of dedicated his life to refuting Schacht. He has another book called, not only Schacht, but Western Orientalism. He has another book called Studies in Early Hadith Methodology, where Joseph Schacht argued that Hadith were fabricated 150 to 200 years later. And what Azami actually goes and tries to demonstrate is that he finds actual written documentation from Sahaba, from the early Muslims, around 50 or something Sahaba who actually wrote Hadith down. Right. And then after them, hundreds and so on.
Amazing. Just to clarify, for those who don't know about Azmi, looking at the wiki page here, he's Professor Emeritus at King Saud University, but he was also a visiting scholar at the University of Michigan, fellow at University of Oxford, visiting professor for Islamic Studies at Princeton University, and also an academic associated with the University of Colorado at Boulder. In fact, I could go on and on. His academic credentials were quite extraordinary, both in the Muslim world and in the West. This is what I find absolutely fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. He also studied in Al-Azhar. And what's interesting, this is kind of related to the Qaradawi book I wrote. When Qaradawi was in prison in Egypt, and he bumped into Al-Azami there. Oh, so yeah, he said and he says something kind of. He says Al-Azami was wearing a black thobe and a white kufi, and the Egyptian guards thought he was a priest.
Wow.
So they told the Qaradawi, who was part of the Muslim Brotherhood, they said, look at you Muslim brothers, you've even made the priest become part of your movement, right?
That's a true story, is that we can read about in your biography of him coming out. Well, when is your biography of him coming out?
Yeah, so about a year. Yeah, it should be about a year or so. Kind of went back and redoing some of the chapters and reformulating some of the arguments. So I'm about 3 chapters in of about 6 or 7 chapter book. I have all of the chapters done. Just going back and redoing some of them, rewriting, looking at other sources before I put it out there.
Is this the first major biography of its kind in the English language?
Of Qaradawi? No, there are some edited volumes on Al-Qaradawi. There are some works that really focus on his political thought or something along those lines. But my book, as far as I know, is going to be one of the first that kind of goes over his life, his political aspects, his law, his influence on Muslim minorities, his jihad, his economics, his influence on Islamic finance, and so on.
Right. Oh, I can't wait. And who would that be published by?
Haven't found. I had a publisher, and still looking for someone. Once I finish it, I'll send it out, and we'll hopefully find a publisher. Inshallah. A work like that certainly deserves to be published by a top publisher. So, inshallah. Well, that's thank you very much indeed, Dr. Emad Hamdeh. Absolutely fascinating subject. I must say, it certainly inspired me to go and read some of these books. I must confess my ignorance when it comes to these particular works we mentioned, but inshallah. We can all gain from this. So, well, thank you very much. And until next time, and good luck with your biography. Thank you. You're welcome.
Take care. Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.